And we're back. So I have a brainstorming activity for you to complete next. This is just something that I'll have you record on your own in your notes. I won't be collecting it, but I have an image for you here. I'd like you to take a look at this painting, and I'd like for you to guess the following. How do you think these different people are related to one another? And what might it tell us about race in Brazil in 1895 when this painting was completed by Modesto Brocos? The painting is titled The Redemption of Ham. How do you think these people are related to one another if you had to guess their kinship relations? Well, the woman on your left is an image of a grandmother. In the middle, we have her mixed race daughter and her white son in law on the right. And this is her newborn grandchild. When Modesto Brocos painted this, he depicted, in a sense, or opened us up to the way in which the sort of racial ideologies that were and in many ways still are at work in Brazil. And that is one in which whiteness is privileged over blackness. So you'll see here that actually in the image, the grandmother is praising God or thanking God for the beautiful fact that her child is light skinned, right? Which is obviously very tragic and tells us something about anti black bias that was prevalent in Brazil at the time, but also continues to be prevalent in Brazil today. You may not know this, or some of you may know this, but of all the countries in the New World and the Atlantic world where enslaved Africans were brought, by far the vast majority of enslaved people were brought to Brazil. So far more slaves there than anywhere else. I think a cogent example of how whiteness is privileged in Brazilian society is seen in the popularity of whitening creams there, anti-Black racism, and the impact of race-based theories and hierarchies within our society of across the world, the globe, mean that dark-skinned people in various countries from say India to West Africa and again Brazil will use these whitening creams which have been proven scientifically to lead to negative health outcomes. So let's start by looking at race in Brazil, and then we're later going to shift to looking at race in the United States. So we're going to use Brazil as a kind of comparison here. There are over 500 racial categories and labels in Brazil. Anthropologists who have worked in Brazil, such as Conrad Kodak, have shown that people even change the racial terms that they use over time. We will get to that in just a minute. But just note that there are many, many, many different racial categories and labels in Brazil, far more than what we typically use in the US, right? So, as I just said before, like in the US, enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil by Europeans far more than, say, to the United States. And the legacy of slavery and anti Black racism exists, of course, both in the United States and Brazil. So there's some similarities between the U.S. and Brazil. One is, the way in which white supremacy has infiltrated beauty standards, the history of enslavement and slavery. But there are also some major differences. In Brazil, racial categories are far more flexible than in the United States. So, as I was just mentioning, Conrad Kodak, who's an anthropologist who did fieldwork in Brazil, along with Madagascar, where I work, showed that in Brazil, people change the racial terms that they use to describe themselves. He found at least 120 different tipos, which is a Portuguese word for types, and kind of that's the way he translated race. But of course, other researchers have argued that there's more, up to possibly up to 500. Now, in the United States, we think of race as something that you're born with. You are born for example, biracial, you're born, you know, Asian, whatever that racial category be, and then it's just that's how it is. That is your race. But in Brazil, the idea is that your physical characteristics will change, right? Let's say it's near the end of summer, you've spent many months outside, your skin is darker than it previously was. You might change the term you use to describe yourself because of the way that your skin has changed. Or let's say humidity might affect your hair texture, right? This is also true of education and economic class. Anthropologists who studied this, who went to Brazil and interviewed people and saw how and asked these questions to the same people over time, found that as folks moved up the social ladder, they were more likely to self-identify as a lighter racial category, right? Now, if they're speaking to someone who's much lighter skinned than them, like let's say the anthropologist who's asking them is much darker skinned than they are, then the person might say, well, I identify as something very light, like a whiter race, for example. So we have environmental factors, we have these social context factors, right? Again, think about this in terms of if someone said, oh, 1 month they said their race was one thing and the next month they changed their race. Here in the United States, we would find that to probably be deeply troubling. But in Brazil, that's actually fairly common, right? As we now know, thanks to anthropological research. So I'm going to spend a lot of this lecture talking about race as a social construct, but it's important for make sure that everyone knows what is a social construct. Social constructs are human-made categories, and thus these categories, right, could be otherwise, right, in another place and in another time period, for example. So again, I've defined it officially here as a phenomenon, concept, or object that is constructed through certain shared assumptions and values by members of society. So social constructions, and you can think of many of them, or right now we're talking about race, but gender is a useful counter example, or not counter example, another similar example, rather. These are not natural or fixed, but they are cultural and therefore they are mutable. They can change over time and they will change from one society to another. Let's take the example of pink equaling feminine or girl, blue equaling masculine or boy, right? Do you know the origins of where that came from? Well, I can assure you that that concept, that particular color, let's say blue, refers to boys, masculinity, male genitalia, etc., is completely random, and it came out of the commercialization of baby products in the 20th century in America. So, for example, if you were to go to Somalia, they're not necessarily going to have the same idea that blue equals boy and pink equals girl, right? Except for the fact that that has been exported to those countries thanks to globalization. Okay. Now, here's the trick, right? So I've just kind of showed you that race is arbitrary. We as humans like to categorize people in various ways, including race. And of course, given kind of just the history of our world and things such as the enslavement of Africans, right? We came up with race became central to the way that we ordered and made sense of our world, but it actually isn't real. Now, here's the problem, right? A common mistake that students make is they say, oh, well, Professor Palmer said race is a social construct. So that means like race isn't real at all. Well, it does mean that race is not like a fixed biological reality, but that is very wrong in the sense that it is very real, right? Racism is very real in the sense that it has very real effects, right? So even if we understand something like race to be a social construct, or even if we understand that ideas about gender are a social construct, that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter to people, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't have real world effects. So now I'm going to encourage you to watch the next video, which again, you'll find the link in the comment box. I will continue this lecture into part 3.